Hello, everyone. My name is Doris Nguyen, and I'm with DTSC. Welcome, and thank you for joining us. We're so glad you're going to spend the next hour and a half with us here. We're here to talk about the Equitable Community Revitalization Grant, and this is the last webinar in the application series. We're just going to give everyone a moment to join the webinar, and we're just going to take a quick poll. And the poll question is, do you have experience with the Fluxx application? Please choose one. I have a lot of experience. I could teach a class. So basically, you could be in our position teaching this class. I have some experience, meaning I applied for a ECRG round 1, or maybe you used Fluxx on a different grant. Or I have no experience. I will be taking a lot of notes today, and I will be steadfastly re-watching the recording of this webinar as I am filling out this application. So go ahead and take 45 seconds to choose one while we're waiting for more people to join, and we'll come back.
Hi, Doris. I'm not sure if you can see the poll, but I'm getting a technical issue where it says you are logged in from another device. Your polling session is inactive. I launched it.
I was able to see the poll and send a response in.
Oh, perfect. Okay, maybe it popped back over to Devin then.
Okay.
I think that someone from our ECRG team logged in, so now has control over the poll. So whoever that is, maybe help us out and end the poll and share the results. Thanks.
Great. So it looks like the poll results are that most people have no experience and will be taking a lot of notes today. So we look forward to that, and also to have you re-watching the webinar a little bit later on as you're filling out the application. And so let's go ahead and re-welcome everyone into the webinar. If you are just joining us, thank you so much. And so let's go ahead and get started. If we can flip over into the next slide, please. So these are the meeting guidelines. So we want to let you know, by participating in this meeting today, you understand that the meeting is being recorded. You may be muted for background noise if that's required. And the chat feature will be used to both distribute information and accept feedback to be read during the Q&A period, which is at the end of the presentation. And now I would like to take a moment to introduce Mariam Tasnif-Abbasi. Mariam has 2 roles here at DTSC. She is both the Brownfields Development Manager, and she also manages the ECRG program. Mariam?
Thank you, Doris, and good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Let's go ahead and move on to our next slide, please. So I wanted to share, like Doris said, this is the 4th in our series of ECRGenius webinars for round 2. We officially opened up our application yesterday, and today you'll see all of our additional information guidelines and our other products popping up on the website. This is going to be a little bit more advanced. A lot of the information on eligibility, on sites and requirements were already discussed in our previous webinar. So if this happens to be your first webinar, we're welcome and happy to have you. There may be some information that would feel new or more intense than you might have expected. I advise you to go back to our webinars 1, 2, and 3, come up to speed, and then take a moment maybe to listen to this one again once it's available. I'm assuming everyone who's here understands what the Equitable Community Revitalization Grant is. We are a grant for nonprofits, tribes, and public entities to apply for funding to conduct community-wide assessments, site-specific investigations, and site-specific cleanups. We've got a one-pager available on our website. It's hyperlinked on this particular slide that really gives a good synopsis of what we are and what we do. And right now, we are officially in open application period. This is our last webinar, as we've already mentioned. Please heed these different deadlines. on getting your agency oversight applications, and our applications close in the first week of October with decisions made sometime early next year. Next slide, please. This is just a recap slide. I'm not going to really go into these details. I sort of summarized some of the really sort of big picture items that we covered in our previous ECRGenius. Number one was an overview of eligibility. I just talked about who the applicants can be. The sites, in addition to a lot of other detail, must be in a census tract of a CES score of 4.0 or higher. And if you're not, your CES poverty percentile must be higher than 50, or the reuse must be for 100% affordable housing. We'll talk a little bit about that definition as we get further on into our application today. And tribal uses are eligible regardless of the CES score. In ECRGenius 2, we covered eligibility, ownership, and access. Really, the biggest piece that we discussed here is our eligibility self-check tool, which has been updated and is available online. Please use that as your first step. One of the pieces that we take very seriously, and it's a big part of our application, is developing a CERCLA liability defense. All of this information was covered previously, but the thing I'm going to emphasize, and you will hear me say this again, is take a look at this table I've got up on the screen. And the way you go about doing this is to just find your box and then focus on the information just that's pertinent to you in the box that you fall in. In ECRGenius 3, we covered engagement, equitable reuse, and our community benefit commitments, really emphasizing the need of and the value that the reuse is going to provide to the community, and how we would like to track those benefits, and emphasizing the use of a sort of a new approach for us, at least, on very specific, concerted, and measured community engagement. So all of these ECRGeniuses are hyperlinked. They're available on our website. At least the slides are. If the recordings aren't, they will be made available very soon. And with that really quick recap, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Natasha.
Good morning, everyone. I'm excited to walk you through our round 2 application. Today, we're going to cover some basic information: how to create, register for an account on Fluxx, how to log in. We'll talk about some tips and things to remember when you're working in Fluxx, and then we're going to do a detailed application walkthrough, and we'll provide some contacts in the case that you guys have some questions. So with that, I'm going to start sharing my screen, and we're going to work directly in Fluxx. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to say is that we've got application questions. They're numbered, and for the most part, they'll show sequentially. However, questions are going to be presented in Fluxx based on the applicant answers, and the order that they appear may not be sequential. So don't worry about the numbering, just answer the questions as they're presented. I'll say all application questions must be answered, tables completed, requested documents provided, and incomplete applications may result in disqualification. So don't rely on the system to give you a warning, even though we've built in as many of those as possible. Please double check your application before you submit and refer to the guidelines to make sure that it's completed. So we're going to start from the very beginning, and I encourage you to follow along in the portal if possible, but otherwise you'll have this recording as a reference as needed. So the first step, you're going to head over to dtsc.fluxx.io to reach the application/grant portal. This is where everything lives for the ECRG grant. So For example, if you are awarded, you'll visit this same website to provide your quarterly updates or request a reimbursement. Let's start with first how to create an account. So when you get to this first homepage, you're going to click on Create an Account Now, and it'll take you to a new form. You'll enter basic information such as organization name, type, your name, your contact information, and then you'll submit that request. Each user should create their own account. There's really no need to share login credentials. If you're mapped correctly, everyone on your team should have access to the form or the application. Something that's really important to note is if a consultant or some user that's external to the organization will be helping, you need to make sure that when the application is started in Fluxx, that it's mapped to the correct organization. We'll talk about this again later, so I can demonstrate it to you, but there's a couple ways to do this. The first and easiest way is for the consultant or external party to register using their own company email address, but using the organization's information that is applying for the grant to register in place of their own company. So here where it says organization name. Alternately, a representative of the actual applying organization can register first, start the application, and then once eligibility is established in section 2 of the application, they'll be able to add additional users that can then edit and submit the application on their behalf. We'll revisit that in section 2, but either of those methods will help ensure that the application is mapped correctly so that all documentation is generated correctly and everything is set up. Another thing to note is that only one user can edit an application at a time. A number of people can view an application at one time, but only one person can be in edit mode. Okay, so once you register and your account is approved, you'll receive an email. Make sure you check your spam. Sometimes it ends up there. And it'll give you a link to set up a password. Okay, so let's fast forward and you have an account and you're set up. Let's go ahead and log in. Okay, so once you log in, this is where you're going to land. On the right side of the screen is information about the portal, the program, various resources we have available for you guys. And on the left is a menu bar, which shows various pages available to navigate to the appropriate records in Fluxx. So what we're most interested here is to start an application. So you'll navigate to the Submit an Application page. Then you're going to find this button that became active yesterday evening, Start an Equitable Community Revitalization Grant Application. So when you click that button, the system will generate a new application for you. And it opens in edit mode. So you can see this is our new application and we've got 3 buttons down here. We have save and close, save and cancel. And so save and close will save your progress, but take you out of edit mode and take you back to the main page where you can navigate to other areas. Save will simply save your progress and will leave you in edit mode. I'm going to say this a few times during the webinar, but the portal does not auto save your progress. So please save frequently as you're working. Cancel will not save your progress and take you back to the main page. So the first thing you'll see here is an overview of some ECRG resources that we have, as well as some tips when you're working in Fluxx. I'm going to review the majority of this, but we do suggest that you read these sections in detail before starting your application. Okay, so the first one is that Chrome is the preferred browser. The second one I'll highlight is that, again, the portal does not automatically save your work, so be sure to click Save often. If you see something in bold, that indicates that it's a required field that you must answer in order to submit your application. You can use the table of contents to quickly move to specific sections within the application. Right now, all we can see is eligibility, but once eligibility is established, the rest of the application will become visible to you. Something else to note is that changes cannot be made after an application is submitted, so be sure to check that before submitting. And the last thing I'll highlight before we actually move into the application is if you're experiencing issues in using Fluxx, you can send an email to applicationportal@dtsc.ca.gov. Please include the request ID, a description of your issue, and reference to a specific question or screenshots if applicable. You can find the request ID at the top of the application in this header here. This is a good way for us to reference what you're looking at. Okay, so we are ready to actually move into the application. Section 1 of the application is all about eligibility, and these questions build off of one another, and they're designed based on the ECRG eligibility self-check tool that Miriam mentioned earlier. And we strongly suggest that you take a look at that tool before you come into Fluxx to determine if your site meets all the requirements, before you come into this portal. So I'm going to showcase some of these questions, and Miriam, if you want to talk about previous webinars that were held that might have more information or point out any specific questions, but I'm going to kind of slowly scroll through and show you what options or what questions are here and what might happen if you answer a question in a way that would deem you ineligible.
Go ahead, Natasha. I'm just gonna jump in a little bit later into the section. And as Natasha said, all of this information is something that you can address upfront by using the eligibility self-check tool, which I believe Vivian has shared in the chat just a moment ago. Thanks, Natasha.
Sure. Yeah, so I'm just going through and kind of showcasing these questions and letting you know. So if you come to a question and you answer it a specific way that would deem you ineligible, this is the response that you would see. So you'll either need to check to make sure that you click the correct response or take a look to see if there might be an issue with the eligibility.
And Tasha, just a reminder to everybody that I know that when you're going through this and you hit some of those like red lines where you say no to something that's required, you're not going to be able to move further in your application. And that's why we highly recommend the use of that self-check tool and application assistance so that you've gone through that ahead of time. The reason why Tasha has put these blocks up into the application is that we don't want to create a situation where your application is ineligible and you've continued with the application, because it is a lot of work. And so these stopping points really are designed for you so that you don't move forward with an application that doesn't meet all of our eligibility requirements.
Thanks, Miriam. So as you can see, we've gone through section 1 of the application and we've answered all the questions that are presented. And so we've answered it in a way that now we can see the rest of the application. I'm going to scroll back up just quickly so you can see the table of contents.
And Tasha, when you're scrolling back through one, if you don't mind, can you hover over 1K maybe, please?
Sure. So I saved our application just to save our progress. You said 1K, Miriam?
Yes.
Okay, here you go.
I just wanted to bring everyone's attention to this particular, actually, you know what, 1B.
Sure.
Sorry.
No problem.
My notes a little mixed up. So As Tasha walks you through the application, you will see certain sections that have points and certain sections that are just for depth of information associated with eligibility. In this section, there is one question that has points associated with it if you are submitting a site-specific cleanup application. So 1B is the question asking if you have a cleanup plan that has been approved by a regulatory agency. And there is points associated with saying yes to that. If it's just submitted to a regulatory agency for review, that's eligibility. So one of the things I am going to be doing as Tasha walks through it is that I will draw all of our attendees' attention to questions where there are points or sections where there are points. Thank you, Natasha. I'm done with my piece on this section.
Perfect. Okay. So as you can see, the table of contents is now much longer and includes all sections of the application. We'll jump right back to section 2 and continue. Okay, so section 2 of the application asks for application contacts and the project team. And this is where a grantee organization may permit access to the application for additional users. Something that's very important that I mentioned earlier, when you're registering or applying, you have to make sure that the applicant organization that's showing here in 2A is the correct organization that, if funded, would be the organization that's actually being awarded, and that would be named on the ECRG agreement. So if the organization name that is showing here is incorrect, you can log out, re-register yourself under the correct organization using your same email address. Then you can email us at applicationportal@dtsc.ca.gov and request that your account is linked to the correct organization and that this specific application is updated to show the correct organization. Please be sure to reference the request ID, which you can find at the top of the application in the header, as I showed before. Okay, so something else to know, any other users that are already correctly linked to the same organization, their names will be visible in this dropdown. So if your organization is completely new to Fluxx, there likely won't be any users in this dropdown, but if you've already been in here, you'll probably see some people. So you can select them as needed for these slots. In either case, you can add additional users and contacts to the application by clicking Add New. And at a minimum, you'll need to enter first and last name and their email address. So once you do that, that user can then use their email address to go to the home page, reset their account, and create a password, which will give them access to the application portal and to this application specifically. Make sure if you do it this way, you enter their email address carefully because you don't have the ability to edit it once it's saved by adding a user this specific way. So if there's a mistake made or if someone's having trouble accessing their account after being added this way, you can always send us an email at applicationportal@dtsc.ca.gov for us to help you troubleshoot that. Okay, so let's talk about these fields specifically. Application main contact is the person that we would reach out to for any issues related to your application. The next slot is going to be for the application agreement signatory, which is they're responsible for signing both the application and the ECRG agreement if they're funded. The signatory will not be included in general project correspondence, and it's the applicant's responsibility to make sure the signatory is aware of their responsibility to sign the application and the agreement and return these documents to DTSC within the specified time frame. These next three slots, you can put users in that might be supporting the completion of the application. Having your name in one of these slots will grant you access to this application where you'll be able to edit and submit. Again, I'll point out that only one user may edit a specific application at a time. Okay, then we're going to scroll down. These two contacts are very important, and they may or may not be the same contacts that are listed above. But these two contacts let us know who will serve as the grant project manager if funded, and a secondary contact. So if you are selected and funded, correspondence from DTSC through Fluxx will only be directed to these two contacts, and it'll be the grantee's responsibility to forward correspondence to their project team as necessary. So if there are any changes to these contacts, the grantee must notify DTSC immediately by either emailing your portfolio manager or ECRG@dtsc.ca.gov to let us know that we need to update this for you.
So
Okay,
Tasha,
moving-
oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, go ahead.
I jumped in a little sooner than you were done. No, go ahead and finish up, and then I'll say something about section 2 before you jump into section 3.
Sure. I was just going to say this last question in section 2 is related to a conflict of interest, and I was actually going to ask if you had, if you wanted to elaborate on this question at all.
Sure. Thank you. So this would be a very specific circumstance where the applicant has some sort of a specific conflict between DTSC. So this is not for entities who are working with us under voluntary agreements, or who are working with us with, from a regulatory perspective on any projects. This more has to do perhaps with the grantee staff maybe sitting on a board and also somehow involved in a leadership position at DTSC. So those would be the kinds of situations where a potential conflict could arise. And so if you think that you have that sort of a organizational relationship with someone at DTSC that could present a conflict, let us know. And then there's some additional paperwork that will need to be completed. What I also wanted to add about section 2, and I'm going to try and do this at the bottom of each section, is talk about like what is the point of this section for us. And so the point of section 2 for us is really for us to figure out, where would our money go? Like who are the contacts? Who would the contacts be for the grantee, for the applicant who's going to be involved with this process? And so really this is just about understanding who we are working with in terms of the applicant organization, and who we would potentially be working with if this becomes funded and we're working with grantees. And so what's really important is, especially with the signatory, oftentimes organizations use someone who's fairly high up in their leadership chain, which is great. We appreciate that. But it's on you as the applicant to make sure that they know that they have to sign the application when the DocuSign email comes through. And we can't be responsible for keeping track of staffing changes and that sort of thing. That's the kind of thing that you need to think through and update Fluxx if it needs to be done so. Okay, Tasha, back to you.
Perfect. Okay, all right, let's jump into section 3. So section 3 of the application is asking for site information. And you'll need to create a site record for each site that is related to your application. So site-specific investigation and cleanup applications are limited to one site per application. The site must be a single contiguous area, but may have multiple addresses or parcels. You may submit more than one application for different sites as well. Community-wide assessment applications are different, and they require at least 3 individual sites per application, and each site will need to be entered as its own record in section 3. So let's walk through how to do this. So to enter a site, you'll click on the plus sign over here on the right, and this will open a new window in Fluxx. So in here, you'll enter information about the site, such as its name, the primary address. If multiple are associated with the site, you can indicate that here. Assessor's parcel numbers that are associated, the latitude and longitude of the site. Please make sure that's accurate. And we've also put together a tool for you guys to use, and we highly recommend you use it to determine the CES Calenviroscreen or CES score of your site, the poverty percentile, and also state and federal districts that your site is in. So let me demonstrate quickly how to use this tool. So when you click on, we have the link embedded in here. You can click on it. It'll open in a new window. You'll land here and you can hit OK. And you can actually scroll and click, to find your location, or you can type in the address. When you do that, you'll see that you've got a few layers here you can click on to find your track number, the Calenviroscreen results. So for the address I put in, it's 44.25. 5.35 is the poverty percentile, and it's also got assembly district, Senate district, and the congressional district as well. So you'll be able to find that information that is required to be input here. So I'll go ahead and enter some information. So when you're happy with everything input here, you can click Save, and that will take you back to the main screen. And you can see that the site, that window that just popped up is now showing here and listed. So the site information has been recorded. You have the ability to delete it by pushing this red circle, or you can go back in to edit it. You can also expand here to see the details that you input into this separate component, and you can verify that everything looks correct. So for community-wide assessments, you'll need to repeat this process at least 2 more times for each remaining site. So by clicking the plus sign, until all sites that are included on your application are displayed here and have a unique ID. If you're submitting an investigation or cleanup application, I'll just emphasize again that you should not have more than 1 site listed here when you submit. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and save. Good practice. And then we'll move on to sections 4 and 5, which are related to site ownership and CERCLA liability and are meant to be answered per parcel.
And Tasha, as you're waiting for your test application to be saved, I just wanted to jump in real quick and share with everybody that the bottom line for section 3 really for us is to understand, the basic information about the site. Applicants define what the site is. Greg Schaefer from our office discussed this in ECRGenius 2. There's a whole slide on the fact that the site can be a portion of a bigger project. Eligibility may be focused just to one piece. So it's really important that when you decide what site you're going to apply for funding for, that site, that piece that you're submitting to us is the one that meets all eligibility criteria. And it's just important because you can basically define your site that way. Because if you give us a site, and the way you're describing it, some of it meets the eligibility criteria and some of it doesn't, you won't end up with an eligible application. So I just wanted to emphasize that. The other thing I wanted to draw your attention to is in section 3, we have one question that is associated with points. The CES score for the site will dictate a CES score for your application. So if your site has a CES score of 75 points will be automatically added to your application. It's just really based on your CES score. There's 2 other points here for bonus points. If you happen to be in a rural site, any one of the rural counties that Tasha is sharing with us right now, there's a 10-point bonus there. And in question, I think it's 3P, if I remember correctly, if there is, if your site has suffered a natural disaster, then you can put a description in there and avail yourself of 10 points associated with that particular circumstance. That's all I have, Natasha. Back to you.
Okay, perfect. So, like I said, section 4 and 5 are related to ownership and CERCLA liability. And we've designed these questions to be specific to parcels. And at this time, Fluxx can only accommodate 2 owners total, where the applicant is one of the owners and a separate party is the second owner. So in the situation where there are multiple owners other than the applicant, please reach out to DTSC at ecrg@dtsc.ca.gov to determine the best way to apply. That scenario may require multiple applications, but then administratively could be handled as one project. So I'll showcase some of the questions we have here. Miriam, I don't know if you wanted to expand on this section.
Over here, I think the bottom line for us in this section is that we want to understand who the owner is, and that's going to delve in more depth in the next section, section 5. But it's really important that we understand that you have access to the site. If you own the site, we assume you have access. If you don't own the site, we want to understand how you will get access. We want to have documentation to that. As you are probably all aware, we only have 2 years for our agreements. That's just because of the way the money was given to us as an organization. And so because of that, we don't have time for any sort of access issue. And so that's why we require documentation on how you have access. And there are also some questions in section 4 on like what your interest is in the site if you don't own it, if I remember correctly. Or actually, am I getting ahead of myself, Tasha? That's not in this section, is it?
No, you're correct. It's
Oh, there you go.
4A4.
Yes, there it is. And so that's just important for us to understand really the fact that you have access, and if you don't own the site, what is your interest in this site?
Perfect. Yeah, and section 5 will guide you through a series of questions. And, you know, if you use the eligibility self-check tool, you should already know what box you're in that Miriam had referred to in the beginning on the slides. And the questions that follow are based on the applicant type, whether or not you're an owner, and your application type as well. So there's a series of questions that will pop up just based on those conditions.
And this is tied to our eligibility self-check tool as well. If we can take a moment, Tasha, if you think the timing's right, could we just pop into the table that I had shared earlier?
Sure.
Devin, could you get that up on the screen for us, please?
Yes, will do.
Thank you.
One second as I switch.
No worries. There you go. So this is the table that I had mentioned that I'd be bringing up again. And so in section 5, you're basically figuring out what box you lie in. What type of application are you applying for? Because this particular series of questions does not apply to community-wide assessments. It does apply to our investigations and our cleanup. And the way you move along the boxes, are you an investigation applicant who is an owner, or an investigation applicant who's not the owner? And the different requirements for each of these boxes show up on Fluxx based on the way you answer the questions. And so you'll get access to certain questions based on your application type. we can go ahead and switch back to Tasha. Thank you, Devin, for sharing your screen. And while we're making the switch, one of the other things I want to say is that we have made available online a PDF version of all the application questions, because there is so much logic associated with the way Natasha and Jess have built the system. You can only see certain questions based on the application that you are working on. We understand there are a lot of other organizations that may be interested in multiple types of applications, or consultants who are providing application support who would benefit from seeing all the questions regardless of the logic. So I would highly recommend that you take a look at that particular document that we either have on the website right now or will have very shortly. That's all from me, Tasha, on this section.
Okay, great. Let's move on. The next section in the application is related to previous environmental activities. So this section is pretty straightforward. And we just want you to provide responses for the site or sites and the specific environmental activities that have occurred to date. And unless you want to add anything, Miriam, I'll move on to section 7.
Sure, please go ahead to section 7, Natasha.
Okay, great. So section 7 is related to regulatory oversight for the site. This is not required for CWA or community-wide assessment applications. However, if a CWA applicant decides to work with a regulatory agency, that is an allowable cost. Investigation and cleanup applications, however, are required to provide proof of regulatory oversight, with the exception of tribes. We do ask that tribes email ecrg@dtsc.ca.gov just to ensure the tribal oversight agency meets the requirements set forth in the Business and Professions Code and Health and Safety Code as well. So if your site is already under regulatory oversight with DTSC, which is the first question that's asked here, the applicant will just need to check in with their existing project manager and provide a hyperlink to their voluntary agreement on Envirostore so that we can verify it's an active site. If your site is already under regulatory oversight with the water board or local agency, you'll be asked if you've obtained an ECRG project suitability letter. So we'll ask that you provide that and upload it in section 13. And I think you can refer back to the ECRGenius webinar number 2, I believe, for more information, on that document. And that is a requirement. So if you've get this far and you don't have that, that's something you're going to have to get before you're able to submit the application.
And Natasha, I just wanted to jump in to remind everyone, this is something that Greg had talked about in ECRGenius too, and it's up on our website as well. There are deadlines. So if you do not have a regulatory oversight agreement in place and you need to get that to support your ECRG application, reach out to DTSC, the water board, or the local agencies and work towards getting into an agreement with them. It does take time. So please make sure that you go to our website and heed those deadlines, because some of those deadlines are set up to accommodate the ECRG deadlines, to make sure that when you put a request in, there's enough time for these agreements to be processed on the regulatory side. So please take a look at the deadlines. I think I had them up in the earlier slide as well. And if you, it's on our website, it's in our ECRGenius previous webinars. We do have that information in a lot of different places.
Perfect. And that's actually a perfect segue. So if you'd like to apply for regulatory oversight, Fluxx is also the place to do that for DTSC and the water through DTSC, but we also talk to the water board as well. So let me show you how to access that quickly. And this will also demonstrate how you can save and get back to your application if you're not able to complete this in one pass. Okay, so the first thing you'll do is save and close your application, which will take you back to the main page. And you're going to navigate back to the Submit an Application page where we started earlier this morning. And you'll see there's a button for Start a Request for Lead Agency Oversight Application. So it's been set up in Fluxx as well. This is how we collect applications for oversight requests. But let me show you when you log back in or out of Fluxx to get back to your application, you're going to navigate to Pending Requests. And you'll need to locate the application that you are working on. You may have multiple. And then you'll need to click Edit in the top right corner to get back into edit mode to be able to add more information. Okay, perfect. So let's get back to where we left off, which is section 8. Okay, so, oh, 1 second. If you have multiple applications in your list view, sometimes you'll want to verify that what you've clicked on is actually refreshed in the screen, because although I clicked on it, it opened a previous application that I had. So let's go back into the correct one. Perfect. Okay, so in this section, this is related to your ECRG tasks and the budget detail. So you'll need to enter your proposed scope of ECRG tasks, which are detailed in the guidelines, and those that reflect the activities that will be completed in the 2-year funding period. So this tool encompasses details of your proposed scope, schedule, and budget all in one place. And we've included a standard list of ECRG tasks to describe the project phases. It's meant to be a list of options for you to choose from based on the scope of your project. Every grantee should include regulatory oversight fees as its own task, with the exception of community-wide assessments, where it's not required. Every grantee should include a grant project management task, as well as a community engagement task. So I'm going to walk you through building an example budget now, just so you can understand how it works and hopefully answer some of the questions you might have. So this works similarly to the site section, section 3, where you'll use the green plus sign down here, which will open a new window. And then you'll need to provide information related to that task. So first is the ECRG task description and/or document name. I suggest that every investigation or cleanup application start by entering regulatory oversight as a task. You'll go to the next field, which is ECRG task, and look at the selection from the drop down. Regulatory oversight fees is the appropriate task for this. Then we've got an estimated start and end date. And so for the start date, I'm going to input January 2024, because that's the approximate date that will announce our round 2 grantees. As Miriam mentioned earlier, any activities that are completed before an ECRG agreement is signed will not be eligible for reimbursement under this grant. So it only covers activities that are after that agreement is signed. Enter an estimated end date. And so for this example, I'm going to assume regulatory oversight will occur throughout the grant period. So I'll make this for 2 years. Okay, task status. You can indicate whether or not the task has been started or will be ongoing. For this example of regulatory oversight, I'm going to choose ongoing. You really shouldn't be including any tasks that are completed, which is an option in here, because those would have been conducted outside the grant funding period, but that could come up later on in the grant period. So Once you input this basic information here, then you'll scroll down and you'll see that we've got specific spending categories, and you'll need to select the appropriate spending category to input the total estimated cost for each task. So in the case of regulatory oversight, it has its own spending category, and all estimated oversight costs related to the project should be included here in this spending category. So let's enter 20,000 as an example. You don't need to break these costs out for regulatory oversight across other ECRG tasks. I think that will become more clear as we continue. So once I'm happy with all this information, I will click Save. And it'll bring you back to the main page application, where you can repeat the process as many times as you need to communicate the full scope. So you'll see it's populated here now in this table, and it's also starting to build a snapshot of the entries as well. So let's go through community engagement. We'll hit the plus sign. Okay, so say we're going to do a community survey and meetings. So this is the title that you'll see in the table that's populated on the main application. We'll go down to the ECRG task dropdown, and we can see that community engagement is going to be the most appropriate task for this. For the estimated start date, again, we'll put this as January 2024. And we'll assume community engagement will occur for the first year of the grant, just in this example. Okay. Task status is going to be not started. Could be ongoing, just depends on what the task is. So we'll come down to these budget details again, and you'll see we've got a few spending categories. And in this case, it's community engagement. So for this example, let's just enter $20,000. And we can see that we've put that into community engagement contracts. So if you have multiple community engagement tasks that you'd like to break out, make sure you're putting all of the costs associated with that into this community engagements contract spending category. I'm going to save. Okay, now you can see both of these reflected here. And again, this is starting to build a snapshot for us. Okay, well, let's add some environmental tasks. Let's say we're planning to do a work plan with a round of sampling. Okay, we'll come down to this ECRG task, and we're going to look through this to find the most appropriate task to describe the phase of work that's occurring. So in this case, investigation work plan and field work is appropriate. Let's assume that we'd like to do that as soon as possible, February 2024. And we'll assume it'll take a couple months, a few months to complete that scope of work. Task status for this is going to be not started. And then we'll scroll down and you'll see we've got an environmental contracts category. And this is where you're going to put all of the core work for the ECRG, the environmental work, all of those costs are going to go into this environmental contracts category. So I would say the majority of your tasks will probably sit in this category. We'll put 20,000 for this example, just to demonstrate. Let's go ahead and add one more environmental task. So let's say investigation report. So reporting on the work that we do. We'll come down to the ECRG task, and investigation report is in this dropdown. And you can find more information about these and which ones are appropriate for each type of application in the guidelines as well. It's detailed there. So we'll assume this will start sometime after the field work is completed. And will take a couple months to complete as well. Not started. Okay. And again, this is an environmental contract, so we're going to just put 20,000 in here for this example. So now you can see that we've got a decent budget built. We're going to add one more line item together, and this is something that all grantees should include, and that's going to be grant project management. So the time you'll need to submit reimbursement requests, do quarterly reporting, managing the grant, that's reimbursable. So we'll type in grant management. Grant project management is an ECRG task. And for this, we'll put this for the entire duration of the grant. And we'll mark this as ongoing. So there's a specific spending category for all costs associated with grant project management. And it's important to note that this cannot exceed 5% of the total amount requested. So for this example, we'll put 4,000 in. Okay. Thanks for bearing with me on that. When you're done and you're happy with all of the items that are showing here, you should look at the total that is presented in this table and make sure that it represents the correct amount that you plan to request for the full ECRG period of 2 years for round 2. If you're satisfied with that amount, you'll need to enter that amount here as well, because this is the amount you'll be requesting. Another thing to note when you're using this tool, we don't want to see contingency included as a separate line item in the proposed budget, so don't break that out. So the rest of the questions in section 8 are relatively straightforward. Miriam, would you like to elaborate on any specific questions here?
Sure. There was a couple of points I wanted to make. This is the first section that we've come across that has a significant number of points associated with it. This is because this is how the applicants get to describe what they need the money for and how the core work of ECRG will be conducted. What we want to see in order to get points on this section is a clearly defined budget that makes sense, that it can be done within the 2-year time period. I know that we've got a lot of money associated with the different grant types. For a cleanup application, you can get up to $10 million for cleanup. But our focus is how much of that can you get done in the 2-year funding period? And this is the section where you describe that, where you set up a budget, you provide an overview of the tasks that you are asking for funding for. And that's what we want our scores to be able to see. We want them in this section to score high the applications that have clearly articulated their budget, the work that's going to be done, and provides confidence that those tasks will be completed within the 2-year funding point. So that's why there's lots of money associated with this, and we'll be looking for shovel-ready projects that are teed up to get off the ground as soon as those agreements are signed.
Perfect. Yeah, like Miriam said, we're looking for a high-level summary of the activities to be completed. We'd like a description of the consequences if the application is not approved for funding. Also some details about the cleanup approach that is being considered or has been selected in the case of cleanup projects. any barriers that are anticipated to complete within the 2-year funding period. Questions of that nature. Okay, perfect. So moving on, the next section is community engagement. The questions are relatively straightforward here in Fluxx. Miriam, did you want to discuss some specifics?
Sure. I would love to do that. So we had UC Berkeley's Othering and Belonging Institute participate as guest speakers in our ECRGenius number 3. They really went into depth on community engagement and some of the sections you're going to see in the application as we walk through this. Community engagement really for us is, we're bringing this money in through ECRG to conduct these very specific ECRG tasks. We want to know that our money is also being invested in a community where there is an open dialogue on how this land is going to be used. How is it going to be made safe, and how is it going to be used, and how is that use being communicated? And so we have questions in here for engagement that's already been done and engagement that is planned to be done over the next 2 years associated with the ECRG. We are using the spectrum of public engagement. This is something that we've talked about in several ECRGenius webinars, in particular in ECRGenius number 3. It is a very specific spectrum that has these 4 levels that we have here: inform, consult, involve, and collaborate. And we want to have applicants define how they can get deeper and deeper in community engagement. There's some minimum requirements for CWAs versus a site-specific investigation and site-specific cleanups. And all of that detail can be obtained through the slides that we have in ECRGenius 3 and also in our guidelines. And so basically these questions and this section is for our applicants to showcase their past community engagement activities, their plans for future engagement, and how they can be innovative in the way they communicate with the people who are going to be impacted by the work that's being done under ECRG and the work that's going to come after. And I think, Natasha, if you scroll down, I can perhaps jump into benefits of reuse as well.
Yes, please.
Okay, so we understand that land revitalization doesn't stop just at the cleanup. Further action has to be done after in order to create spaces for people to use, in a better way than the land has existed before the cleanup had been conducted. And so the benefits of reuse is where you showcase what the primary proposed reuse is for the site, where you describe the plans, how that reuse will be made, provided and provide benefit to the community that already lives there, works there, plays there. So there's a lot of emphasis on locals and making sure that the uses are ones that are not being developed for people who are outside of the community, but really have the existing community in mind. And there's timeline questions that we ask. And so this section also has a number of points associated with it. And I think, it's from an application standpoint, it isn't complicated. You don't have to use the plus sign. You're not building in tables. They're very straightforward narrative questions. The green text, every time you see the green text, that's where you see points associated with it. I'm going to take a pause here, Tasha. I think this is a good time to maybe turn it over to Doris to talk about what Fluxx will look like if you are proposing a housing project.
Perfect.
Thank you, Miriam. So I wanted to give just a little bit of context. If you are selecting that you will be building housing. So as Greg had mentioned in the webinar too, he gave just an initial touch on the eligibility criteria if you are, building housing. We talked about a mixed income housing and then also 100% affordable housing. So two different types of things. And we also touched it on the third webinar regarding in the reuse section. So, mixed income housing, if you meet the CES score, if you meet the poverty requirement, great, let's build it. But if you don't happen to, we also talked about 100% affordable housing being an option for you. We wanted to make sure that you did fit the certain criteria though. So we wanted to make sure that in both cases, for both mixed income and for 100% affordable housing, you do have to comply with the requirement that 40% of all the units are at or below 60% AMI, that no affordable units are higher than 80% AMI, and that the average of all the units, even the market rate units, are at or below 60% AMI. So even if you're mixed income, we wanted to make sure that the average of all the units are at or below 60% AMI. And if you have any questions regarding that, you can apply for a technical assistance, for application assistance, and CERCLA can help you out with that. So the questions really are geared towards, asking us specific questions, describing what I had said. So you have to add in the total number of units. You have to describe them by the AMI percentage. You have to mark an X, whether it's market rate or for sale, or for rent. So that's all information that we would like. In particular, the AMI percentage and the market rate, you have to let us know, because if we're calculating mixed income, it's a little bit different if we're doing 100% affordable, and that lets us know how that's done. So then as you move on to the little bit lower sections, you would describe the total number of units, the average AMI, and then so depending on the information above, you would answer the questions, that I described, the 40% of the total, the average of all of them, and then are they all under 80%?
Thank you, Doris. So I just wanted to pop in real quick and refer everyone back to the guidelines and the eligibility self-check tool. We don't allow for 100% market rate housing, but we do allow for mixed use housing for the higher CalEnviro screen scores. If you go lower, then it has to be 100% affordable. So any question, and any applicant who's going to be doing housing will have to actually complete these the series of questions. If you're not doing housing, then this won't pop up for you.
Correct. Okay, great. Let's continue. So we've made it all the way to section 11, which is related to community benefit commitments. And the way you'll enter these is similar to the site section, similar to your proposed budget, where you're going to utilize the plus sign down here to enter specific commitments. And we do have some requirements based on application type and also amount requested. Miriam, did you want me to go over this quickly, or did you want to jump in here?
You know what? I think I just wanted to say that, like we've talked about the purposes of what we're looking for from different sections. Section 8 was really, how are you going to spend our money? Section 9, community engagement, was how are you going to communicate that and how are you going to involve the community? Section 10 was, what is going to happen to the site after it's cleaned up and how will it revitalize your community? This particular section, community benefit commitments, which we lovingly refer to as COMS internally, is all about how are we going to track that? You said through your application that you're going to provide value to this community, and our investment will be followed by some tangible value. This is how we make that value tangible, by having you commit to to providing value to the community. You have several categories that Natasha is sharing right now from which to choose from. And we have options to choose from a particular list, or you can come up with your own, because we don't, we don't know this entire universe. We know that there's a lot more to this, and there's different ways value can be provided to communities. And these are things that we will track even beyond the life of the grant. Most of the things that we talk about, our money and the work, that's all within the 2-year funding term. The Comben comms are based on what you commit to as part of your application, but we will track them to completion. And that's just the point I wanted to share, Natasha, on this particular section.
Perfect. Yeah, and for each commitment that you input, you'll need to answer 4 specific questions describing the commitment, how it will benefit the populations, the strategy and what actions will be taken. Tell us what metrics you'll be using to track that progress and when the estimated date for completion is. And so let me just input a couple answers here so you can see what that looks like when you save. So again, works very similarly to section 3 and section 8. You can see the commitments that have been entered and the answers that you provided here in a list view. You have the ability to edit and delete if needed. And keep in mind that community-wide assessments have to have 1 community benefit commitment. Site-specific investigations must have a minimum of 2. And cleanup applications under 5 million need to have 2, above 5 million requested need to have 3. Perfect. So moving on to section 12, this is.
Oh, you could have? Huh? I know you could have. Ooh, I know.
This is related to equity in contracts, and it asks the applicant to describe competitive and inclusive contracting practices to be used in support of the ECRG funded project. Miriam, did you want to add anything about this section?
No, I think it's pretty straightforward. I just wanted to emphasize this, and we put this in, we discussed this in ECRGenius 3, if I remember correctly. We are looking at bringing equity, in different ways. And that's why equity in contracting is a really important component in the way that our money is spent. We emphasize the requirement to have competitive contracting practices in place. And we also highly encourage the use of small and other disadvantaged businesses.
Thanks, Miriam.
You're welcome.
So moving along, we've made it to section 13, and this is where we're asking applicants to upload all of the required documents. The way to do that is pretty simple. Again, you're going to find a green plus sign if you're starting to notice a trend. You'll do that to open an upload box where you can add files. We are asking that the documents are named in a certain way to help us organize our files. And we have that showing here. We'd like you to reference the request ID _ document type. And we've got some examples under each document type of using an example request ID just to provide you with one example. So you'll click the button, you'll add a file, and then you'll click upload. And when you do that, this component will disappear and it will be housed here in this requested document section where you can make changes if needed, you can delete, or you can add additional documents as well. So we are asking that all applicants, regardless of application type or applicant type, provide us with a completed standard 204 form and 205 if necessary, as well as a site map and some site photographs. Blank copies of the standard 204 and 205 forms are available on our DTSC ECRG website. I think our new applicant resources page for you to download and complete. and that should be included with your application when it's submitted. But you'll see there are other there are other documents that are going to be required. So if you're a nonprofit, you'll have to provide proof of that. If you're the site owner, you'll need to provide proof of site ownership, access agreement if you're not the owner of all parcels, so on. So I believe that's detailed in the guidelines as well, and the correct document should show up based on those conditions in your application. Okay, we are almost at the end. Section 14 is just asking if there's any additional information that you'd like to submit that wasn't covered. So that's not required, but if there's anything else that you need to let us know. Section 15 is signature and attestations, which states the terms of the application. And this is where you'll be asked to provide a signature, but only after the submittal has occurred. So again, please only submit when you have reviewed the application for completeness. Following submittal, the signatory that you indicated in section 2 will receive an email from DocuSign that we initiate at DTSC. That will likely happen after October 9th if your application is submitted near the deadline. Otherwise, it'll probably occur within a couple days of submittal. So the applicant must use the DocuSign email to electronically sign, and you'll need to look out for that email and also alert your signatory that it will be coming. Okay. If there's nothing you want to add to that section, Miriam, we can talk about the poll where we'd like to get some feedback.
Yeah, I think we're good. I'll have you close out by touching upon the poll, and we'll turn it over to Doris so we can keep some space for questions.
Perfect. Okay, so yeah, down here, this very last section, we would just like to get some feedback from you guys about how your experience was completing the application, what kind of support you've had. So once you're ready and you're happy with everything that you've input with your application, you'll go to Save and Close, which will take you out of edit mode and will bring you back to the main page. At that point, the submit button should be available, and you'll click it and you'll submit the application. And again, I just want to emphasize the application won't be accepted unless we receive the signature through DocuSign as directed. Once the application is signed via DocuSign, it will be reviewed for eligibility. Once your eligibility is confirmed, then your application will be scored and applicants will be notified of decisions in early 2024. So that concludes our walkthrough of the ECRG Round 2 Fluxx application. A user guide is coming, but this video will be posted maybe by the end of this week, and you'll get an email with a link to it. So now I'll turn it back to Miriam or Doris, and we can go to questions.
Thanks, Tasha. I'll just turn it over to Doris now.
Yep. So thank you very much. Devin, if you don't mind bringing up the slide with the Q&A instructions. We can go ahead and read those instructions. So thank you to everyone who has been putting questions in the chat. I did see that Sebastian did answer some of them, but it might be worth it to actually re-ask them just in case people were not monitoring the chat, and you know, we can answer it for the whole. But before I do that, I do want to start with the question and answer instructions. Please use the raise a hand feature if you want to be invited to unmute your audio. And you want to ask a question live, then we can do that. And then I will call upon you. I will read some of the chat questions, and then if I find that people raise their hands, we can move to that. But if you happen to be on the phone line, we're going to ask you to press *9 to join the phone queue, and that I will say the last 3 digits of your phone number. And then when it is your turn, I'll ask you to press *6 to unmute your line. So please remember, you need to press *6 to unmute so that we can hear a question if you are on the phone. And then again, please use the chat feature for your for questions if you are on the Zoom call. So let's go ahead and start with some of the chat questions. And again, thanks Sebastian for answering some of them. We're just going to go ahead and read through them. The application portal on your website says not yet available. We had mentioned a little bit earlier that some of the items are not quite available yet. They should be up by the end of today. And so thank you for your patience on that. The Fluxx portal is open. So if you do want to get a head start on filling in your application, Vivian, if you could put that link back in, the Fluxx link, that'll be great. So the applications are open. We are taking them if you wanted to start your application. The next question is, can one agency have multiple accounts?
I believe they can, but let me pass it on to Natasha to answer that question correctly.
So generally, there isn't a need to have multiple accounts, but multiple users from the same agency can have as many accounts as needed. So they'll all be linked to one organization, but you'll just have multiple users.
Okay. If an organization already applied under round 1, do they have to use that same profile, or do they need to start a new profile for round 2?
Same profile.
If you wanted to start a new profile, could you?
You could, but you'd have to use a new email address. You do have the ability to link the same user to multiple organizations. It would just depend on a specific use case for me to give a specific answer.
Okay. So I did see that Christina Ridley did ask a question, and I believe Sebastian answered it about the documentation. And so, Christina, if you didn't feel that your question was answered sufficiently, please call for application assistance and schedule a separate appointment. Okay. And then the next question. Let's see. Calvin virus screen score. Oh, are there multiple addresses? So Tina had mentioned about multiple addresses as part of the site. I think that Natasha did answer that afterwards, and thank you, Tina, for acknowledging that she did answer that. I think it is worth repeating, though, just in case some people didn't hear it. If you do have multiple addresses, Natasha, you press that the plus button, the green plus button in the right-hand corner, and it has a green circle around it. Is that right, Natasha?
Yeah, so to enter your site information, you'll use that plus sign with the green circle around it. And within that window that pops up, there's a place for you to enter all addresses that are associated with your site. So if you're doing an investigation and a cleanup application, you only want to click that green plus sign once, and you want to provide all the information necessary in that one window. However, if you're doing a community-wide assessment, you are going to click that plus sign at least 3 times.
You know, now I don't see any hands raised, so we're going to continue on with the chat. So Yamini was asking if there is a passing score based on the points for each site.
I'll go ahead and take that one, Doris. Thank you. So there isn't a passing score. First, all of the eligibility criteria have to be met, and all of the applications that meet the eligibility criteria will be scored, and we'll make decisions based on the relationship between the scores and the money that we have available for that particular round.
So there's Miriam, who is not our Miriam, at DTSC, a different Miriam, different spelling, was asking about round 3 and when we can expect that.
First of all, I always love to take questions from Miriam, so thank you for participating, and you've got a great name. I would say that we are right now planning, depending on how things go, making sure that everything, the money is still truly available to us, to open up round 3 sometime next fall, about a year from now.
All right. So we just want to make sure that everyone knows that the full recording will be up if you wanted to follow along again as you're going through the application. So we've got those links in there. Okay, so Yamini was asking, should we open a DTSC VCA or just the portion of the site that we apply for? What if the site is part of a larger project like a trail?
So I think that's something that you'll have to discuss with the Brownfield coordinator you are working with. At DTSC, oftentimes when we start looking at a site the way it's defined, depending on the situation, we may end up going off-site as well as we chase the lateral extent and the vertical extent of contamination. So I think for that particular question, it's a matter of understanding how is the site set up, what the contamination profile is, what the conceptual site model is, and then making a determination if just bifurcating a smaller portion of the site for oversight makes sense. So I'd say reach out to Greg Schaefer, our statewide brownfield coordinator, and he could help you figure out what would make sense for regulatory oversight.
There was a question about estimating regulatory oversight fees. One of the responses was to ask your regulatory oversight agency for an estimate. But what if, for example, your regulatory oversight agency, you couldn't get it from them in time? So could you estimate the regulatory oversight fees?
I would say that the way our regulatory oversight application section is written, you either have to get that regulatory oversight cost from your DTSC project manager. If you're working with us, we provide annual cost estimates. So I would request a oversight cost estimate from a DTSC PM. And then for the project suitability letter, I feel we have those built in to the agreements, because the voluntary agreements are associated with oversight costs as well. And I'm going to see if Greg Schaefer, if you're on the line, could you speak to that?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. I would say for your regulatory oversight cost estimate, like Miriam said, your DTSC project manager should be more than willing to give you a 2-year estimate. If you have any problems obtaining one, just reach out to ECRG at DTSC, and we'll see if we can get them to do one internally. For your for any regional board or local agency oversight, I think from my conversations with them, they would also be willing to give you that that 2-year cost estimate. But really, like Miriam mentioned, what we are looking for with that project suitability letter being a required document is that you're having conversations and a good amount of engagement with your regulator, so they understand the scope of work that you're proposing in this application for funding, and that will also help inform them on an estimate on what their regulatory oversight costs are going to be. So our recommendation is always to engage your regulator early and often, and if you engage them before that, either the September 5th or the September 11th deadlines that we have in the guidelines, they should be able to give you that 2-year cost estimate to help support your application.
Thanks, Greg.
Thank you, Greg. So I didn't see anyone. Oh, we just had Haley. Haley, you raised your hand. If you could please, thank you. Come off of mute and then ask your question.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I missed part of this presentation, so I apologize if this has already been addressed. But I believe in the program guideline, there's an eligibility requirement that all cleanup work to be completed within the 2-year grant funding period. So for my specific project, the Regional Water Quality Control Board is requiring some long-term O&M activities to be in place after the 2-year period. Just wanted to ask if this will prevent us from being eligible for this funding for the site-specific cleanup.
So if your application's reuse is housing or school or daycare or some sort of clinical use, then your cleanup plan needs to account for a cleanup that doesn't require O&M or long-term maintenance. That goal does not have to be reached in the 2-year funding term. So I think you might want to have a conversation with application assistance to work that through because, it's just a very specific circumstance. We're very clear that if you're planning for those sensitive uses, then your cleanup plan has to account for cleanup without the need for long-term O&M or stewardship, but we understand that we would only pay for maybe the capital costs of setup or startup or starting that cleanup. So it really depends on how your cleanup plan is written, and that is why our entry point into cleanup, site-specific cleanup grants really are cleanup plans that are solid enough that we know what the cleanup is going to be.
It sounds like with a approved cleanup plan, it is okay to have some O&M activities beyond a 2-year period.
No, if the site is eventually going to get to unrestricted land use, then it's okay for those sensitive uses. If it's just O&M in perpetuity with no endpoint, then we can't justify that as getting to a full cleanup or getting to a cleanup that no longer requires that. So if there are some provisions for additional sampling to understand how effective the remedy is going to be, that's going to happen beyond the 2-year time frame, there still has to be an endpoint to that, because if you don't have that endpoint, that means you are not fulfilling the eligibility criteria.
Understood. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. And if you want to have more conversation about this, feel free to go ahead and sign up for application assistance.
Yes, we are in contact with
You wanted to say?
I just want to clarify that we are working with CCLR.
Okay, good.
Great.
And I'll ask anyone from CCLR if they have the need to come to us for sort of more in-depth. We are happy to help out with that and then share the responses with everybody through FAQs.
Thank you.
I do recognize that our time is up here, but if you can stay with us and want to go through some questions, I think that we'll stay on. We completely recognize that some people have to fall off due to other commitments. So thank you. Thank you for staying on, those who can. So I'm just going to go through Spencer's question on the chat because it's actually very similar to what we had asked. And then I will go, well, hold on. Spencer does have his hand raised, so maybe we'll come back to his question. And then I did see Michelle's hand first. So Spencer, hold on just a second. I know it was a related question, but Michelle was first. We'll go to her first. And then we'll go to Spencer.
Okay. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. My name's Michelle Wong, and I live at a place called the Los Angeles Eco Village. We have acquired and rehabbed a garage, auto body shop, almost a quarter acre. And this is within urban Los Angeles. There's 2 more garages across the way from us. And we know the owners. We helped them save their land about 15 years ago from eminent domain. And I was wondering, even if we don't necessarily own the land yet, if we can apply for funding towards, creating the mechanism so that we can acquire the land. We do have a land trust that has over $2 million in land, and also utilize the technology that we've pioneered, utilizing fungi and native plants, of which we're going to get the results within the next 3 weeks, in terms of the 53% reduction in particulate and lead and organophosphates. In order to eventually apply to this land, which we don't own yet, but we have every mechanism to be able to acquire.
So Michelle, first of all, it sounds like you have a really fantastic project, and it's the kind of project that we would love to see come into ECRG. My broader answer to you is that there's a lot of different eligibility criteria that you have to check off. Not being an owner is not an issue. But, who is the owner? What kind of grant are you applying for? Does the owner have a CERCLA liability defense? Do you have access? All of those components are, important eligibility criteria. So I would have you go through the self-check tool, make sure you can answer yes to all of those questions. And if you can, go ahead and start an application assistance call, because the work that you're doing and your approach sounds really exciting, and it's the kind of project we'd love to see.
Thank you. And there's a second question would be if any of the money can be utilized towards rehabbing old buildings that have a lot of lead. Currently, it's low-income housing and a drug and rehab facility that's in buildings that are over 100 years old.
No, I understand. Our money is only for environmental assessment, environmental investigation, and environmental cleanup, and specific tasks that are adjacent to that very specific work. So something like rehab and rehabilitation of existing buildings is not something that we would cover unless your regulatory oversight agency has determined that that is part of an overall cleanup plan. So that's a very specific circumstance. And so generally my answer would be no.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Right, so I'm going to read Spencer. I recognize that Spencer has his hand up. I'm going to read your chat question first, just as a little intro. So to make sure that we answer that question, and then I'm going to let you unmute yourself so you can either continue the question or ask another one, Spencer. Okay, so Spencer was asking about the vapor extraction and the long-term operations and maintenance, what we call O&M. So it's a related question to Haley before. And so he wanted to ask about whether the O&M is limited to just the 2-year grant. Now, Spencer, I'm going to ask you to unmute. You can continue on with that line of questioning or ask another one.
Hi, thank you very much. It's actually kind of adjacent to this vapor extraction. Our site has been impacted by an off-site source contiguous with our property. So cleanup for our site is very limited. We don't have access to this contiguous property. And what our goal is in redeveloping this vacant lot for low-income housing is to install some mitigation measures, including a vapor barrier. We're under oversight with DTSC. They seem to be on board with kind of our proposed mitigation measures. But those mitigation measures would require some O&M, verifying that this vent system and membrane are functional over a course of multiple years. And so I guess specific to our site, I'm curious if that would be covered under this grant, or is it at all, or is it just limited to the 2-year grant period?
Thank you for your question. So we only cover the work that can be completed in the 2-year grant funding term. As I'd mentioned before, for housing and other sensitive uses, the cleanup plan has to account for, at some point, getting to unrestricted land use levels, which means no O&M, no land use covenants. And so for your site, even though your site is not the source, and since you are contemplating affordable housing, you would not be eligible unless you have also included something that would actively remediate the property. And it's a little bit, I understand it's a little bit untenable because your site is not the source. You'd have to run your system and pull somebody else's plume in. But because we are looking at really encouraging community considerate cleanups, one of the components of round 2 is that we really do want to aim for these cleanups that get us to a more specific endpoint than a long-term O&M in perpetuity.
Okay, understood. So any form of land use covenant, deed restriction, anything like that on a property would basically make us ineligible if we weren't able to perform the cleanup per se.
Yes, that's correct. Now for your site, one of the proposals that could work is that, you know, you put on, you use our money to set up, you know, pay for we'll invest the capital cost to set up like an SVE system. So the SVE is running on your site in addition to the mitigation, the vapor barriers as a temporary measure, and the O&M as a temporary measure. But we only cover what you put in those 2 years. It's a tricky situation because we all know that cleanups, you know, take longer than 2 years, but we had to build this grant around the expiration dates of the way the money was given to us. But yes, and unless there's some innovative technology that you can use to actually, you know, remove the contamination, it looks like your site may not be eligible.
Understood. Thank you very much for your help.
You're welcome.
Thank you. This next question is for Natasha. Jennifer was asking, do the number of characters available include spaces? So in many instances, open answers say, you know, 1,000 characters, things like that. So she's asking whether the spaces count as characters. Natasha?
Yes, they do.
Thank you. And so Nancy was asking, for housing, does the applicant need certified housing element or can it be adopted? Now, I do know in our questions, we do have a question 11A that's related to public policies. You do get extra points if you are, if your city or your jurisdiction happens to have policies in place that support things like equity in our programs. So not necessarily it has to be in place or adopted, but you do get extra points for that. Miriam, did you want to?
No, I think you got it.
Okay, thank you. All right, and then Michelle, I think you already asked your question. All right, and then Cynthia is asking, will housing questions appear if your project includes temporary shelter units? I think it's a question for Natasha. If you could show, if we can go back to Natasha, and then show maybe section 10 in the housing.
And I don't know in the guidelines anywhere if we've created any separation between temporary versus permanent. It's either housing or it's not. And if it is housing, even if it is temporary in nature, if you are considered to be housing, then the housing questions will have to be responded to. Does that make sense, Doris? Yeah.
Can I ask whoever is sharing to stop sharing so I may share? Thank you. Okay, so currently we have it set up where if you are doing 100% affordable housing or mixed income housing for sale or rent, you'd have to answer those additional questions. So right now we're not asking for that information if it's 100% supportive housing. So I'm not sure if that's what this would fall under, but that's the way we have it set up in the application currently.
So how it's set up is, Cynthia, you would have to answer as one of those questions in order to get the housing questions to come up. If you do have a question about that, you can reach out to us and then maybe we can address your question more specifically. There is at the very end, Natasha did show a point where you, the very end, where there's something else that you want to just describe to us that's not in the application, the additional information, thank you, Tasha, that you can describe it there.
Okay, I thank you. We actually had a TA conversation about a month or so ago, and this was one of the questions that the team was going to go back and get further clarification about, because these would be temporary 48 to 72 hours, and whether or not those are considered as part of affordable housing, or if you're calling it supportive housing, that definition is just, it's very specific in terms of housing, and shelter programs are very specific and a separate definition in terms of affordable housing, or in terms of housing, I'm sorry. So I'm confused. So I can call that.
Sure. Cynthia, would you mind putting your contact information in the chat?
Sure.
You have an option to put it to the host, so you don't have to share it broadly. I can also put my information in the chat. You can reach out to me so that we can answer you specifically. Let me do that, where I just put my information in the chat. I don't want you to broadcast your information so broadly.
Yeah, I think that would be
I'll
great.
send it directly to you, Miriam.
Yes, that's fine. Go, I'd say go ahead and send it to me or Doris, and then we
Okay.
will figure it out. And then whatever answer we provide, I'm sure we'll share this through a FAQ because other people might be thinking the same thing.
Yeah. So I also just shared my email in the chat to everyone. Okay. If you have any specific questions that we didn't answer here.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Sure. Okay. So Michelle was asking, can the funding be applied toward rehabbing old buildings over 100 years old, currently drug rehab? So I don't think we're rehabbing the buildings themselves. What we're looking to do is more like a soil cleanup, things like that. So we're not looking at, you know, historic rehabilitation of structures. Not part of the ECRG scope, but thank you for asking the question. Okay, Cindy, thank you so much for putting your information in the chat. I appreciate that. Okay, I'm just gonna save that offline here. Okay, so that's all the chat questions. Let me see. Spencer, you still have your hand up. Did you want to ask another question, or can I lower your hand for you? Spencer, do you want to come off of mute if you had another question? If not, then we're going to go to Yamini, who has her hand raised.
Hi, yes, thank you. I just had a question about our project. It involves investigation and cleanup along about approximately a 2-mile stretch of a former railway alignment. And based on phase 2 information that we already have, we know that there is lead and arsenic contamination up to at least 5 feet deep in some areas. So would DTSC encourage in situ cleanup alternatives that would be sustainable, such as capping in place or partial removal of contaminated soil, which is obviously going to result in less greenhouse gas emissions, or would considering any type of deed restrictions in this case will result in our project being ineligible for the grant?
If the site is going to be used for sensitive purposes, like housing and hospital daycare, then you know, that's a different story. You can't have any kind of deed restriction or O&M. But I'm going to ask the question a little bit of a different way. I'd say work with your regulatory oversight agency, because we, through ECRG, are not really, you know, making those decisions on a site-by-site basis because we don't understand the site circumstances. You know, we are looking at using innovative technologies, more sustainable technologies, on-site treatment technologies. These are all the kinds of things that we want to highly encourage our grantees to utilize when technically appropriate. But we understand all of that's dictated by a series of very specific site circumstances. So I'd say that's a good question, but where that ultimately falls will have to be made on very specific circumstances in consultation with your regulatory agency.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Yamini. Michelle had a follow-up question regarding the rehabbing of the old buildings. So she had asked if there is actually lead involved in the contaminants. Michelle, if you can come off of mute, could you just clarify that you mean lead in the buildings or like lead-based paint, or did you mean lead was flaking off and is now in the soil? So you're looking at a soil cleanup. Michelle, if you can come off of mute, that'd be great, and clarify that question.
If Michelle's unable to come get back on, I'm just gonna answer the question by saying, I think very clearly what we had said before to Michelle. If the contamination is in the soil, then that's something that will be addressed. It can be addressed by ECRG under regulatory oversight. If it is in the building, then that's a building issue, and that's not something that we can cover.
Okay. Okay, yeah, I think there's enough land, like in a yard, probably a eighth of an acre. I don't know if there's regulations as to how big the land has to be or how small.
There's no regulation. I think it's all the other eligibility criteria have to apply in terms of the who, why, what's going on, and the CERCLA liability defenses. So we haven't really had an issue, I think, with the size of a site. It really is about meeting all of the other eligibility criteria.
Okay, thank you. It could be
You're welcome.
multiple sites, as you.
Okay.
Right, I don't see any more questions in the chat. I do see that both Spencer and Yamini both have your hands still raised. I don't know if you have different questions than were already answered. No. Okay, Yamini, did you have a different question? No? Okay, great.
Sorry, I didn't lower my hand.
No problem. Thank you. Appreciate it. Okay, thank you, everyone. I think that's all we've got. No, I don't see any more hands raised, and I don't see any more additional questions in the chat. I appreciate everyone who has stayed over an additional 20 minutes with us to answer the questions. And thank you so much for Miriam and Tasha for doing that. Miriam, you want to give some closing remarks?
Just thank you, Tasha. Thank you, Doris, and thank all of you who joined us today. And we, we hope to see all of you represented in our first cohort, or our second cohort of grantees, I should say, in early next year when we make announcements on who our new grantees are. So thank you very much, and have a great day. Bye-bye.